This is part 2 of lesson 10 corresponding to chapter 10, using common firewalls. We're going to talk about managing the firewall on an internet service provider connection device. First, you need to enter the IP address of the device into a web browser. If it's a wireless router, you need to change the service set identifier, the SSID. You should limit the number of connections. You should block unnecessary ports. You can test the configuration at http://www.grc, that's Golf Romeo Charlie.com. And it has a free Shields Up port scanning tool as well to help you. In converting a home router into a firewall, most home routers are shipped with all the security features turned off. Because plug-and-play results in immediate connectivity, many users never go back to configure their equipment for security. To access a home router, type into your browser the IP address of your gateway. So you need to see the image of the Linksys setup, 2 slides from this one. Choose Start, then Run, type Command. At the C:\prompt, type ipconfig. That's ipconfig. Most routers ship with a default address of 192.168.1.1. 192.168.x.x is a non-routable range of IP addresses, which means that traffic inside that address range will not be shared with addresses outside that range. And the other thing about that is that you cannot do a NSLOOKUP command on a 192.168.x.x IP address in order to determine who owns the that particular address and get a result. You cannot determine what domain and what website that particular address belongs to, because it is a non-routable range of IP addresses. So it's as it says, non-routable, and it's not possible to determine what domain that address belongs to. There are many domains that have a 192.168 address because they all have wireless access points. You should consider changing your settings. First, if the router is a wireless device, change the SSID from the default setting, and this is important because most PCs will grab the strongest wireless signal from a known SSID. You should change your default IP address range to something other than 192.168.1.x. Most routers use Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, DHCP, by default. You could lock down your network by either hard-coding IP addresses into each authorized machine and turning off DHCP, or setting a strict upper limit on the number of devices permitted to have DHCP leases. Most default settings are 100. If you have standardized SSIDs like Linksys in your wireless access table, and here's a Linksys image, you may find yourself on a neighbor or hacker system someday without realizing it. By changing the default IP address, you're creating a custom range for your own network. Regarding the number of default devices, if your home has 5 such devices, set the upper limit as 5. Although, this could be limiting if you have friends or relatives visiting with their devices. You'd have to change the configuration table to allow more devices. Here we have the router name. It's using automatic configuration DHCP. The local IP address 192.168.42.1 and the subnet mask. The DHCP server is enabled. The starting IP address would be at 192.168.42.100. Here's where we talk about the maximum number of DHCP users is set to 50. Again, if the default were 5, you wouldn't be able to have anybody but 5 devices on your network. But here we have the default of 50, and that should be more than enough for any home device. And then static DNS address 1 and 2, and so forth. And of course, the time zone automatically adjusts the clock for daylight savings times. You want to make sure that's correct. Ports to permit. Ports that should be open at all times. Port 25 for SMTP, you need to permit that. That's outbound email. Otherwise, you won't be able to send an email. Port 53 for DNS, the main name system. You won't be able to access a web address properly without that. Port 80 HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. You can't get to a website without that. Port 110, that's POP, the Post Office Protocol, and without that you cannot initiate a request for an inbound mail. Port 443, you need to enable this because that's your HTTPS. That's going to provide you your secure connections to the internet, and you won't be able to buy anything on the internet from a website without that. Ports 465 and 995, SMTP and POP together, the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol and Post Office Protocol together, and port 1024 to 1035 are DCOM ports for downloading files. You could permit only certain ports and limit others, determine which ports you need to access the internet, and then block all the rest. Remember that doing this setting restricts outbound traffic. So why block it if it originates from within? Well, malware, zombies, bots, and other hostile applications usually have to connect to the outside to do their damage. So if one has been downloaded accidentally to your computer, it's not damaging your computer, but you could end up with, sending out massive amounts of email that you did not even know you were going to do, which could have your internet service provider shut you down. So obviously, if it originates from within, blocking certain ports will prevent these particular types of applications from running and from emanating from your machine. Note that beyond port 1035, you may not need to allow outbound traffic. High number of ports are often used for online gaming, such as Xbox, but if you don't have any gamers or Xboxes in your house, why allow those ports to be open? That just allows more more of a potential problem where people trying to get into your wireless access point, through your wireless access point into your computer. So you really want to avoid those ports above 1035 if you can help it. Ports to forward. A clever way to use a port policy to thwart external attacks is to forward to a non-existent port. So if your local network range goes from 10.20.30.40 to 10.20.30.49, you might forward incoming requests to port 120.20.30.99 where nobody's listening, and then an external attack will go nowhere. In the meantime, some ports that you should forward include ports 20 and 21, FTP, File Transfer Protocol, data, and FTP itself, port 23 Telnet, port 53 DNS, port 80 HTTP, ports 81 and 82 overflow for port 80, ports 137, 38, and 39 are NetBIOS, 443 for HTTPS, 445 NetBIOS for Windows 2000 and later, and port 3074, the Xbox game port. Of course, if you don't have anybody playing with Xbox, you really don't need to worry about that. Commercial versus open source firewalls. Commercial firewalls, of course, are available for purchase. They install onto your own hardware operating system. They provide network-level security services. Open source, of course, are free. The source code is available for review, but they're not always reliable or trustworthy. Appliance hardware firewalls. A dedicated hardware device specifically built and hardened to support firewall software. Does not require additional hardware or software deployment. Needs network connections and a power connection, though. Has dedicated hardware resources not shared with other services and can protect a single system or an entire network. Now, firewalls, specifically hardware appliance firewalls, typically have two or more network interfaces. A firewall with two interfaces is known as a dual-homed firewall, while a firewall with three interfaces is known as a triple-homed firewall or three-legged firewall. The benefit of multiple interfaces is that the segments, subnets, or networks connected to each firewall interface are electronically isolated from each other, preventing unfiltered traffic from leaping from one segment to another in an attempt to bypass firewall filtering. Some examples: Barracuda, Cisco, D-Link, Fortinet, Juniper Networks, Linksys, which is owned by Cisco, Netgear, SonicWall, WatchGuard, Zyxel. Virtual firewalls include virtualized software firewalls that provide filtering services for a standard physical network. They are firewalls running between virtualized client and server operating systems. The benefits are rapid development, quick prototyping, isolation, traffic management, quick recoveries, and testing. Simple firewall techniques. After writing a firewall security policy, obtaining approval, and obtaining the firewall to install, the first step in deploying a new firewall is to change the default password of the administrator account. Testing is essential. Many firewall appliances can be quickly reset to factory defaults with a simple press of a button. And beware of accidentally doing this. Keep a printed or written copy of all the rule sets and settings on hand. Periodically verify manually that all settings remain as you want them, and regularly visit the vendor's website and discussion forums. In summary, to conclude the chapter, we talked about the types of firewalls available for personal SOHO environments, router wireless access point firewall settings, Windows firewall with advanced security common security tools in the personal SOHO environment, and selecting an appropriate firewall for personal SOHO environments. This concludes Chapter 10.